Please be quiet. Please be quiet.
Michelle,
Yes.
did you say something?
Oh, not yet.
Okay.
We're live on the site, just not on Facebook just yet. So we're just going to hold 1 more minute.
Awesome. Because I was getting a robot voice on my end. I don't know if I was the only person getting a robot voice, but that was a fun moment of robot voice.
No, I also heard the robot voice.
Technology, it's weird. It's hard. That's why we have wonderful creative collective here to figure out for us. Katelyn, what's your cat's name?
This is Lilith.
Lilith. Can I introduce your cat with you when I do introductions?
Yeah, if they're still on screen, absolutely.
Okay, and we're live.
Awesome, great. So good evening, everyone. I'm Sid Sennett. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am a proud member of North Shore Pride's board and the moderator for this panel, Disability Awareness, a discussion for all about compassion, allyship, and advocacy for the disabled community. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, members of the LGBTQ+ community and our allies. North Shore Pride's mission is education and advocacy for and about the LGBTQ+ community on the North Shore. And this panel tonight is a part of a series we've been holding monthly about different educational forums that we've been hosting virtually because of the pandemic. We chose this topic and this date because today, December 3rd, is the International Day of People with Disabilities. And we're celebrating by having these incredible panelists answer questions about disabilities and talk about their own work in and with the disabled community. So to start off, I want to say a big thank you to our interpreters tonight, Kinsey Williamson and Elizabeth Keegan. We're always super grateful to have partners interpreting services with us. I'd also like to thank Joey Phoenix and Michelle Garcia from Creative Collective. They help with all the tech stuff, and it wouldn't be possible to do this without them. And then last but not least, I want to shout out our friends at Eastern Bank for all the support that they've given North Shore Pride. So thank you all so much. And now I'm going to go ahead, and I'm absolutely honored to introduce you all to our guests tonight. So if you could just give a little wave to the audience when I introduce you, that'd be fantastic. So to start off with, Lisa Orgettas, she, her pronouns, Executive Director of the Disability Resource Center. She's over 25 years of human service management experience and is passionate about advancing access and opportunities for people living with disabilities to live as independently as they choose to and advocate for an accessible and inclusive community. And then we have Katelyn M. Mills, she, her pronouns. Massachusetts Social Security disability attorney and founder of Burke Law. She's an attorney who dedicates her practice, which she opened in 2018, to helping people with disabilities navigate a complex Social Security benefit system. Her bottom line belief is that becoming disabled should not mean having to struggle to afford basic and essential needs any longer. And then we have Olivia Richard, she, her pronouns, disability rights activist and member of the City of Boston Disability Commission Advisory Board. She has fought for equality and civil rights for all people in Washington, D.C. with ADAPT, challenged Maura Healey to play wheelchair basketball with Spalding Adaptive Sports, and is currently enjoying that, but I'm a cheerleader is free to watch on YouTube. Me too, me too. Then we've got Katelyn Gebhard, whose pronouns are she, her, and they, them. An accessibility advocate, production format specialist at Harvard Business Publishing, and a graduate student at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Their work explores how research-driven and participatory design can address challenges related to accessibility and inequality. In addition, as a production format specialist, they spend much of their time trying to make their products as accessible as they can and expand the limits of their workflow. Next, we have Brian King, he, him, and they, them pronouns, HIV medical case manager for North Shore Health Project in Gloucester. He's been working in public health for more than 15 years. And then for 10 years, he was the director of PRISM LGBT Health prior to their current position at North Shore Health Project. He's also a singer-songwriter in the band What Time Is It, Mr. Fox? And then we've got Vesper Moore, they, them pronouns, community advocate and director of organizational equity at KIVA Centers. Vesper is the director of organizational equity throughout the KIVA Centers. They're also the director of the ZIA Young Adult Access Center and are the administrative oversight of the Karaya Peer Respite. Vesper is a community activist, survivor, trainer, and writer. Vesper has experience working as a consultant for both the United States government and the United Nations in shaping strategies around trauma, intersectionality, and disability rights. Awesome, it's so wonderful to have you all here. Along the way, I'm going to be asking our panelists some questions about their work, specifically general questions about disabilities, things that the audience might want to know, and then kind of what it means, what the word disability means to them. So I'm going to start off with Lisa actually tonight. Just to start off, what does the word disability mean to you?
Disability means that there's a challenge in place, but that it shouldn't affect your life, that you should be as able and informed and advocated and being able to manage your life in any way that you choose.
Fantastic, awesome. So could you maybe explain to me a little bit about, there are some different, when talking with you, you mentioned in your emails invisible disabilities and acquired disabilities. So I was wondering if maybe you could go over what those mean for us as well.
Sure. So most people think when they think of disability and it's not something they're familiar with, they close their eyes and they think of, the child with Down syndrome, and they think about the person who uses a wheelchair. And to them, that's disability, when it is so much broader than that. And disability means having something that impedes your activities of daily life. So it's something that organically will make your life more difficult. Invisible disability is something that you can't see. It isn't obvious that this person has some form of disability. It could be some mental health concerns. It could be anxiety, depression. It could be some underlying medical condition. You don't see it. And oftentimes what happens is that those people are marginalized as potentially faking it because you don't see what's going on for the person. And so sometimes people will get out of their cars and they've got a handicap placard and they're in the spot and you judge them because they're walking away and you think, why is that person scamming the system? So we make these pre-sorted judgments. Acquired disability is something that you're not born with. It is something that you acquire over time. So it could be something where you had a stroke, where you were in a car accident, where you had to have, an amputation, all these types of things that we acquire as we go along. And the thing is that the longer we live, the more likely we are to acquire disability as we age, because certain things do change for us. Mobility issues, hearing issues, sight issues, any kind of medical conditions. So it's a much broader community than we think. And there's a lot of, I was speaking to a group one time and we're talking about the agency and disabilities and such, and it was a Rotary. And one of the guys asked, his mother was in a nursing home, and something along the lines of he didn't think that she had a disability. And I'm thinking, well, there's a reason she's living in this nursing home, because she has some form of life-altering issue. So people just don't think in those ways. But it does behoove us all to think in broader strokes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really comprehensive. I wonder if maybe if anybody else has any, I noticed some nods as we were going around. Anybody else had any idea? I saw some nods, particularly when you mentioned like thinking of things in a much broader sense, where we have this like one picture that we kind of think of when we think of the word disability. And even these specific pictures that we think of when we think about invisible, acquired, visible disability. So does anyone else maybe want to hop in? I think I saw Vesper nod a couple of times there.
Yeah, I was nodding particularly around the aspect of invisible disability, because when I think about invisible disability, I think about psychosocial disabilities, I think about psychiatric disabilities, which I am someone who has experience with that. And I think about the fact of disability really meaning to me that systems are inaccessible to us, and more of a sense of a social model. You know, the fact that there's nothing inherently wrong with how we are, who we are. It's the fact that, you know, systems and society largely is not designed to, you know, in a lot of ways be accessible, or in a legal sense meet the accommodations needed for a lot of us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was wondering too, if maybe you mentioned psychosocial disability. I was wondering, I think maybe some of our listeners at home might not know so much what a psychosocial disability means. Would you mind like kind of explaining or going into detail on that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. So the disabling nature of what might be encompassing, like a mental health diagnosis, for example, or different experiences around mental health. I personally am someone who has felt at many different points in time that my psychosocial experiences could be considered disabling, but I identify as a mad person in the reclamation of, you know, just like how queer folk reclaim the term queer, and the fact that there is a lot of systemic categorization of inherent human experiences that are then pathologized and then in turn used against the public in a lot of different ways. And I don't view a lot of the experiences that I have as inherently disabling. But I do view others as inherently disabling, and that's actually up for me to decide and not for others to decide. And I think that that's when I really get into the whole idea of the social understanding and societal understanding of the term mental illness. And the fact that with most mental health diagnoses, actually any mental health diagnoses, there aren't any biomarkers in the brain that have yet to be found. A lot of it is social and behavioral categorization. So when we think about it in that sense, referring to mental health diagnoses as mental illness is actually inherently taking us away from the point of psychosocial disability or psychiatric disability, which within itself is ableist. So I'm actually a proponent for the term mental illness within itself being ableist.
Lisa, I'm noticing a hand. Did you have something you wanted to say?
I definitely do. Just playing off what you said, Vesper, part of, you know, my work is enhancing people's feeling of pride, you know, of people of a group and our tribe, and the history and the great work that's been done. And a lot of work that we do, especially with our younger folks, is understanding what their disability is, because a lot of times the parent really hasn't shared that, but then bringing them along to understand that you should have pride in who you are versus what the world might consider you to be. So it's a big part of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that kind of what Vesper was mentioning about the MAD movement and identifying as a MAD person, which is something I want to circle back to in a bit. It definitely is that kind of, you know, reclamation, that pride. I think that's really brilliant. Yeah, it's a really good thing that we can do for people who are disabled and the disabled communities to like make those spaces for people to claim pride and not do this whole like, oh, it's so sad to be like this. So fantastic. I was wondering if maybe on the topic of pride and disability pride, if Olivia, you maybe had anything to say about that.
Yeah. When people look at me, they see the stereotype of disability. I am a person who uses a wheelchair. But I haven't always, and it took me a while to realize that that's a new aspect of me that I needed to be okay with. And I became more than okay with it. I'm actually quite proud of what I've survived. I mean, I had an infection that almost killed me. And I plowed through that, and this is the battle scar, you know, if you will. And for a lot of my friends, you know, whether they were born with their disabilities and they've had that life to lead since they were kids, or whether they've acquired their disabilities, it's something that you know, almost like we're proud to be LGBTQIA plus plus. It's another aspect of us that we celebrate and embrace.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that, you know, we see a lot about disability, like acceptance, awareness, but not a lot of embracing, a lot of, you know, like these more positive terms that aren't just like neutral or like, you know, like bearing it, you know? So I think that that's really wonderful language. Thank you. Thank you. I was also wondering while we're chatting, what maybe like the idea of disability means for you more generally as well. Like, what you would either define it as, or like what are some of the things that you are prideful about when it comes to disability and identity?
I mean, it's more than just the joke about parking. It's there's a whole community of folks that I've gotten to know and love in Boston, in the North Shore, in Massachusetts, and in the United States, of people with disability and people who are disabled, people who go through all types of challenges from society and from the medical system. Our medical system is very, very let's fix it, as opposed to let's teach you how to live with it, and let's give you the tools to live with your new condition.
That's a really great point. Absolutely. I was wondering, talking about kind of like the medical system, like talking about things like that, maybe switching over to Brian King, who that's like part of his work. I was wondering, what are some things maybe that you do in your practice to kind of like address that, or maybe how have you noticed different kind of like things? So to kind of explain, you do work with HIV and AIDS and addiction, which, you know, have a very strong medical component. So I was wondering if maybe you could just speak to some of that.
Thank you. And also just, it's wonderful to hear everyone's perspective and to be in this room of so much experience. I'm really excited to learn from a lot of you. Something that I wanted just to jump on when we were talking about the invisibility of disability, and to put it in context for many of my clients who have been living with HIV long term and then maybe have other issues that they face around like mental health or trauma history, PTSD, addiction history. Something that I run into a lot, just to contextualize it in the system, like of how our systems often fail people with disabilities. Say the housing system, someone might have Section 8, they might be in housing, And the reason they're in housing is because they have a disability, which might be, you know, a whole series of issues is why they were able to be, why they're recognized as disabled by the federal government. So it could be HIV, it could be, say they have a bipolar diagnosis, and they are housed specifically, say, in a place that serves people who are elderly and disabled, that is the housing is for, and they may have a manic episode, and then they lose their housing because of their manic episode, because the, you know, the housing authority or the staff aren't trained in trauma-informed services, aren't trained in mental health, and, you know, and don't have those resources. They haven't been funded to have those resources. So that person then loses their housing when the whole point was to keep them housed so they could thrive and have a safe place to live. So so that's something I deal with a lot on a daily basis. It's, do you have any more questions? I kind of like went off on that, but that's kind of what I was thinking of as other people were speaking. That's kind of like the major one I see is how systems don't, you know, even if there's meant to serve someone with a disability, they often fail them. And I think that's something that I hope people can become more aware of and have more understanding about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something I was just about to ask, with your work with like addiction. I feel like that's something that happens up because it is such a stigmatized thing, and there, you know, often can be different sort of like legal issues that happen along those lines, that like it's just really sets everyone up to fail instead of to like find what they need to like take care of themselves. I was wondering if maybe you could, well, first of all, let me ask you, what is addiction to you? Could you maybe just speak to kind of like how we were talking about with disability in general, maybe just speak to what addiction is to you?
Well, for me, quite personally, I feel that addiction can cover a whole range, and but I really admire, there's a therapist and researcher, Lisa Najovitz, who did a lot of research in the 90s, and she created Seeking Safety, which is a treatment for people with PTSD and addiction. And most of her research has shown that a majority or and a lot of addiction, what we call addiction, is really based in trauma. You know, it's people are treating their trauma with substances, and so we stigmatize that, and often that's what's being treated. Oh, we have to, you know, we have to get into abstinence only. We have to treat the addiction, and then we'll deal with the trauma later. Well, her approach in Seeking Safety, which is used all over the world in many treatment centers, focuses on both at the same time. And I think that's something I wanted to, you know, always highlight, that I think for many years it's been the philosophy, which works for many, of a 12-step abstinence only. That can be very effective for many people, but for lots of people it isn't appropriate. And a more harm reduction approach, where we understand someone's history and their story and how substances came into play for them, and maybe some people use them, you know, to deal with their own mental health issues, and they do it in a way that's safe, or maybe could be safer. So addiction for me is it's often a stigmatizing word. Immediately we go into sort of the medical model of addiction, which, you know, people can have physical addictions to substances, but I think trauma is really the word that comes up immediately. Is in most cases, in my experience, and I think the data supports it, most addiction is based in some sort of trauma, which can include, you know, systemic racism and homophobia, transphobia, homelessness, and then neglect from addiction in your own household as you were growing up, things of that nature. So that's what comes to mind.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I think that really ties in a lot with what Vesper was mentioning earlier, about, you know, we have these medical categories, and we've got all these boxes that we like to place people into, when, you know, trauma often being trauma informed goes kind of, gets swept under the rug, and we don't necessarily think through the lens that you both have been mentioning. So I also wanted to ask real quick, you mentioned harm reduction. Could I have you kind of expand on that a little bit? Because I know not everybody knows what harm reduction is, maybe.
Well, harm reduction is a public health approach where, when you're working with folks who have many, many issues and just need assistance in their life, you meet them where they're at. Like I said, I use the word story. They come with their story and they lead and tell you what they need. And you prioritize what that person needs in the moment or in the long term, what they want to work on. So I think many times when it comes to substance use, a lot of folks want we need to get them clean. We need to get them in treatment. That might not be what they need right now. They might need, food or wound care or clean needles or condoms for sex work, or, what is it that they're needing right now in their life, and everything that they've brought to the table. Because harm reduction is evidence-based. It's been shown to work. Helping people make healthier choices and become healthier in their lives, because we're focusing on what their priorities are. And I think it's always important to remember that everyone is, even if it's not an effective approach for risk reduction, people are always making choices and thinking about their health and thinking about their loved ones and thinking about their survival. And so we kind of meet them there, and form a relationship where there's no judgment. It's compassion. You come here and you're welcome to come back anytime, in any place where you are. If you're using, if you're not using, if you were working on something and then it didn't work out, you're welcome, because we're here to support you. And over time, many people do find that they meet their goals, because they're not stigmatized for being failures. And something I want to really point out that we experience all the time with drug use is that many people who've experienced overdose, or friends have overdosed, or they have wounds that need to be dealt with, don't go to the ER because they keep getting discriminated against, or the finger wagging comes out and they don't feel comfortable, and they actually put their lives more at risk, because that carceral punishment, you better do what we say attitude doesn't help. It helps some people, but it doesn't help a lot of people. So that's kind of harm reduction in a larger nutshell, I hope.
Absolutely. That was a really wonderful explanation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I'd like to double back at some point to talk about goals and meeting goals and what that looks like for different people. But while we're talking kind of on that punishment, mentioning legality earlier, and kind of these different systems that can work against people with disabilities, I kind of want to transition over to Katelyn Mills, and ask just a little bit about your work and what you do. I know we have some questions for you about SSDI, SSI, but maybe just talking about what disability and working with disabled people looks like for you.
Yeah, so like you just alluded to, I work with people who have disabilities and they're looking to claim their Social Security disability insurance or their supplemental security income benefits, which is 2 programs that's run by the federal government. And these benefits, they're different benefits, but they're both designed to meet the same goal, which is to help provide financial support to people who have significant disabilities that are preventing them from doing substantial amounts of work, but they're just making it more and more difficult over the years to obtain these benefits. So I work with people with disabilities to advocate for them. Unfortunately, it's a system that has this reputation of being riddled with fraud, and that just has not been my experience. Every person who comes to me for help has genuine concerns about their abilities to work, and I help them to express that to the people who need to hear it.
Awesome. Yeah. Could you maybe expand a little bit on those programs that you mentioned and just kind of go in a little bit more in depth of what those programs actually look like and are?
Yeah, so there are the 2 primary programs is Social Security disability insurance, which is one benefit, and the other is supplemental security income. And while they both look at this, like medically, they look at disability the same way, the primary difference is in financial eligibility. So with Social Security disability insurance, you have to have worked for so long and paid so much in Social Security taxes to be eligible. But if you're someone who was never able to do that, there's still this supplemental security income program for people who are low income or have limited resources. And it helps to just meet like the basic cost of living, food, clothing, shelter, that kind of thing. So it's a monthly financial benefit that somebody may qualify for. And it also ties into Medicare and Medicaid in some ways as well. So it helps people become eligible for other health insurance programs.
And can you maybe talk about what some of the people, I know it can be kind of complex and it's usually like, can be pretty case by case. And that's where, you know, often sometimes people, you know, hit walls and stuff there. But what kind of people or what kind of things makes a person eligible for these programs?
Well, it's interesting that you were asking people, for example, how they define disability, because just like everyone here would probably define it a little bit differently, the federal government defines it differently than, let's say, another state program would be. So they're looking to see people who have significant medical conditions that are either going to result in death or last at least 12 months. And because of that condition, that person is unable to do a substantial amount of work. And what I mean by that is if you're somebody who has a disability that, you know, you can still do maybe a little bit of part-time work, or you're somebody who was working full-time, but now because of a disability, your workload has significantly been reduced. If you fall into one of those categories, as well as somebody who's not working due to a medical condition, these are programs that you're going to want to look at and apply for.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I think now I'd like to transfer over to the other Katelyn for a little bit and just kind of ask you like how, you know, Katelyn just mentioned again, the idea of like everybody in this room probably would definitely define disability differently. What would you define disability as for you?
Sure. So I tend to think of disability as the gap between what an individual wants to do or needs to do and the thing that they're trying to do or the thing that they want to do. And it's a lot of it has to do with the systems and tools and the world that is presented to the person. There is also, you can't really discount the experience of a person who has like a condition or some different experience, but it's sort of this balance between the world and what this person is bringing to that world, and the gap between those.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that makes sense for what it is that you do and your work that is mostly about accessibility. So if you want to maybe expand on that and talk about your work with accessibility, it makes a lot of sense why you would see it that way, knowing the stuff that you do.
Sure. Yeah, so I tend to use the word gap because it makes it sound a little bit more approachable. It's you can address this gap, you can fill the gap in, you can build a bridge, you can make that gap smaller. So accessibility is making the world in general an experience, whether it's a product or a system, usable, understandable, ownable by as many people as possible, regardless of what they are bringing to that experience. And kind of what other people have said, there is overlapping with other types of systems. Like when you try to make something accessible for one group of people, you might be excluding a whole other group of people. If you say, oh, I'm checking the box for putting closed captioning on something, someone who is blind or low vision, those closed captionings aren't going to help them. You need to have another option. Yeah, so accessibility is a lot of creating as many options for the experience as you can to limit the gap that people might have in accessing that experience.
Awesome. What are some, if this is something that you can speak to, what are some of like the common things that you notice people need accessibility wise, or the different types of gaps that you notice many people are experiencing that need to be filled?
Oh gosh, unfortunately, there's so many. So when we learn about accessibility and we're taught, make things accessible, the top items are, making primarily visual content available for someone who doesn't have that visual experience, who's blind, who's low vision. So providing text descriptions, alt text for images, like in social media, anywhere, government pamphlets, anything. Closed captioning for videos, if you're putting something on TikTok, on Instagram Live, or whatever it's called now, putting YouTube content out there, making sure you're having closed captioning. An ASL interpreter is even better for something like this forum where lots of people are talking and you don't have an automatically generated closed captioning, which is fallible. But there are lots of other types of options that make experiences more accessible. Having space for people to be late for something. Not everyone, there are a lot of different reasons why someone might not be able to get to an event right on time. It might take them longer to travel to a place. They might have something going on with their mental health, and having like a grace period is like one way to make something more accessible. These are just a few top things.
Thank you for those examples. That's awesome. I noticed I was getting a couple of nods from Lisa when talking about some of these common things. Is this in your work? Are these some kind of things that these gaps, sort of things that you also notice?
Oh, absolutely. I see things personally on a daily basis. You just run into these things where it's just laughable. As an example, I went to a custom pharmacy. I needed specific medication made into a compound. And I went to this pharmacy, which is where people often get their medication, and there was no accessibility. They had a step up to get into the building. They had quote unquote ramps on either side, but they had great big flower pots in the middle. Little things all the time. And part of our work definitely is to offer our services to businesses and organizations to give them a perspective on how ADA compliant they are. And little tiny things you see all the time. There's a lip to get into the handicap bathroom. All these things are constantly there, and I see it in all different places. And people are trying, but we live in a part of the country where there's a lot of old buildings and the accessibility is really poor. And within Massachusetts, the other piece that is of concern is the ADA regulations for architectural access differ from Massachusetts to the federal level. And this has been an ongoing issue for 15 years where we've been trying to advocate. So according to the Massachusetts regulations, businesses or organizations or whatever are doing any kind of upgrade of a certain percentage, they do not have to have accessible employee areas. So someone like Olivia, you trying to get a job, and then there's 3 stairs to get into the employee area. All that kind of stuff is deplorable, and there's been a big fight in the disability community for 15 years. So it's a big concern. It really is.
Yeah, I would love to, if Olivia doesn't mind, I would love to hear from her on, I know in the picture, the headshot that you sent us, there's actually a picture of you by, I believe it's like the T, is it? And showing kind of some accessibility issues. Can you speak maybe to your perspective specifically on that?
Yeah, I've done job interviews in stairwells, like at the landing of a stairwell. I've been in hospitals where the room itself is not accessible. Like I've had to use the hallway bathroom as opposed to the one that's in the room. It's, you know, there's this belief that because a building is so old that it doesn't have to be made readily accessible, and that is false. It doesn't matter how old you are or how old your building is, you have to make it readily accessible. And there's just strong historic commissions, lack of and apathy, quite frankly, as to wanting to bring places up to code. And as was just mentioned, the AAB for Massachusetts is very different than the ADA architectural guidelines federally. And so there's a lot of, you know, which takes supremacy. And in Massachusetts, building inspectors really enforce the AAB, which is a substandard guideline.
Thank you. And that's, I presume, something that in your like advocacy, which is a lot of the work that you do, like you kind of, what kind of stuff do you do to challenge these, like in bad systems, basically?
Boston, the city of Boston, our commissioner, Commissioner McCosh, the disability commissioner for the city, who's also the Title II coordinator, for make sure that the ADA gets enforced in the city. Her office has put out what's called an Article 80 checklist. And if you want to build or modify something that's a building in the city of Boston, in order to get the permit, you actually have to fill out this special checklist. And it follows, you know, how many elevators do you have? What's your method for getting over this barrier and that barrier? And, you know, how many curb cuts are you going to put in front of your establishment? That type of stuff. Also, the strength of the Disability Commission, and that the Disability Commission is often looped into big projects in the city directly, has meant that the disability voice has gotten into planning and development. So we're not having to build these buildings and then retroactively someone like me tries to go in and is like, you know, all I want is a froyo and I can't get it, you know, or all I want is a job and I can't get it. So it's the fact that we're hitting the barriers at planning and development whenever we can has meant that these housing, schools, businesses are going up, and there's accessibility built into the framework. And it's more than just the typical access. We've had advocates whenever possible, try to stay away from fluorescent lighting and go to LED, because fluorescent lighting is extremely harsh and hurts some folks with disabilities' eyes. Or it's a barrier for some folks in the neurodiverse community. You know, it's thinking about everyone under the big tent and not just putting in a ramp, putting in an elevator.
There are lots of gaps to be filled for sure. I totally, making some connections between, I do that as if like my Zoom screen is the way set up the exact same way that all of yours are. You guys are a diagonal for me. But yeah, no, there's definitely these gaps. There's a lot of them to fill, and it's not just as simple as adding closed captioning or adding a ramp. And oftentimes, like you said, it's trying to not build the building the wrong way the first time, and then yeah, exactly. I think there's another accessibility issue that we maybe haven't touched on as much yet, which is money. And I was wondering if maybe Katelyn Mills could talk about that a little bit in your work, since that's kind of what you do, and kind of the unfairness of, like, I know for some people, I don't know a ton about it because this is not my work, but for some people with disabilities, there's things, the incomes that they can't have, things that they can't buy, things that they can't do because the government controls sort of some of their access to stuff.
Yeah, and I have a cat here who's desperately trying to say hello to everyone. So excuse me if you see me moving over here. But yeah, a lot of people who come to me, it breaks my heart. They're in some of the most difficult positions. I've seen people coming to me where they can't afford housing. The list for housing, anybody who works in that area knows how long and how difficult it can be. They might qualify for some, food stamps, but it's just not enough. And the unfortunate thing about trying to get help through this program, the Social Security Disability Insurance and the Supplemental Security Income, is the significant wait times for them as well. I mean, when somebody applies, if you're in the best position, then maybe you're looking at a benefit in 3 months, but that's if you're one of the people who goes through the process swiftly. Otherwise, you could be looking at over a year. So it's really difficult. My heart breaks for a lot of the people who come to me for assistance. This program is designed to provide that financial benefit, but like I said before, it can be quite difficult to obtain it. So that's why there's a lot of people such as myself who have a lot of gratitude to do this kind of work.
And do you find often or sometimes even at all that, people, if they are getting benefits, that they're really, really just bare minimum kind of things, and that they can't, necessarily have a disposable income, can't maybe get a new phone or things like that? Are you noticing that at all?
Yeah, and it varies greatly, especially between the two programs. But if you are somebody who, like I said before, maybe never had an opportunity to work and pay enough Social Security taxes to get the Social Security Disability Insurance benefit, which is a higher amount, and instead you're looking at Supplemental Security Income, at most you're going to receive somewhere around $780 a month, and that's at the most. So that's, for a lot of people, maybe that's covering their rent and food, cell phone bill perhaps, but yeah, it's quite difficult. So, I mean, fortunately, there are some state programs that can supplement that I'm sure somebody else can speak more to. But yeah, it's still quite a challenge, even when somebody's approved for these benefits.
And then just one last thing, what would you maybe recommend for people who maybe are tuning in right now and are interested in potentially trying to access some of these benefits? Is there like a specific website you would recommend going to, or
website that I would recommend going to? I mean, no, I don't have a specific website that I recommend. There's a Disability Law Center that does a lot of information on there. Do your research online, but reach out to people that you think you can help. Look into advocacy groups or attorneys like myself. because what you'll hear from a lot of people and what people will probably read online too is that everyone gets denied the first time they apply. And I don't want that to prevent people from trying. It's not true. People do get approved. Are the denial rates quite high the first time? Yes, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the case for everyone. So looking to speak with somebody who can really dispel some of the myths about the programs and walk you through would be a good idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One other thing I want to talk about, I know I'm really hammering on this idea of accessibility and gaps and stuff, but I think it's important for our audience, both, people who maybe identify in the disabled community who are watching this now, feeling seen that these are like, yes, this is something I struggle with. And then maybe people who don't know, because there are things that have been brought up in this conversation that don't relate to, I don't have those disabilities, I don't have those issues, those accessibility issues that I'm like, wow, I never thought of that. I was wondering maybe, and it's no pressure if not, but Katelyn, have you noticed, Katelyn Geb, have you noticed that, it's two Katelyns, have you noticed at all with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I suppose anyone can speak to this, have there been has accessibility kind of gone out of the window when it comes to certain things with businesses, closing, or have you noticed different kinds of gaps and accessibility issues related to the pandemic at this point?
So yes and no. There have been a couple gaps. I'm also a student, and the last year, the material that we got as part of our reading, our professors were much better about giving us a lot of options for having, if there's an audio version, here's the audio version. This is, a web page or a PDF, it's accessible. This year, not so much, but I know they're very busy. But I've actually noticed a lot more things being more accessible during the pandemic. With a lot of events being virtual, being able to go to the doctor on your laptop. If you can't get out the door someday and you need to talk to your doctor, you can call them up, or they might not have offered that service before. People are more able to work remotely. And it's kind of like, oh, look, everyone can work remotely. There's no, damage to productivity. This is great for everyone, where a lot of companies were against having remote workers. So with the pandemic, I think that in some ways, people are more aware of the options we can give people and make experiences and jobs more accessible. It's a little bit balanced out by the huge vulnerability to the virus that a lot of disabled people have. So I think that there have been a lot of really good benefits though to the pandemic, but in terms of accessibility, there's still gaps, I think.
Yeah, I've definitely seen posts online talking about sometimes with the pandemic, it makes you wonder oh, we could have done this whole time, you just didn't want to. So absolutely. I think I saw a hand from Lisa.
So yes, I just wanted to add a couple of things in regards to SSI and SSDI and the application process. Another resource is your local independent living center. We oftentimes will work people through the application process, the appeals process. We will help people gather the appropriate paperwork. We can help them understand the difficult process. And yes, we will oftentimes then try to get lawyers involved, but it is a resource. The other thing to bring about with the whole pandemic and COVID is the upcoming wave of evictions. And a lot of folks have been displaced from their jobs and didn't make a lot of money in the first place and have not been able to make their rent. And while there are raft programs in place, they're extremely tedious and difficult to process because they're so overwhelmed. And we're definitely looking at an eviction, just a horror story coming up. And most of those people are folks with disabilities and of low income. So it's a significant concern going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's an important idea to bring to people's attentions right now. Absolutely. I was wondering if I could transfer back over to Vesper for a little bit and talk about the idea of we've talked about eviction, we talked about money, we've talked about accessibility to buildings. We just touched on the idea of like virtual events and stuff. I was wondering, maybe with your work at the KIVA Center and things like that, what are some gaps you've noticed for people with psychosocial disabilities, and maybe some ways in your work that you've done to like address those, if that's something that's like kind of on your radar a lot?
Well, I think, and yeah, thank you for bringing that up. One of the most important things as of recently has been really having a discussion about some of the things that we've just brought up, which is like, even though things have been more accessible as of recently, but the cultural issue of the access was always there, but it hasn't been brought up till recently, has been a source of dialogue for a lot of people with psychosocial disabilities in our community. I also do want to say that largely another piece is that something of need has been, for example, things like just having groceries available to people, having technology available to people, education around technology available to people. All of these things have been important. And the reason why is that there is an inherent fear of, going outside. And people really can overlook that fear and belittle that fear, by people saying like, oh, this will pass over, or oh, it's okay, we don't have to take this seriously, or like, oh, it's just like the flu. And the fact that there are people who have very valid fears in this, and being able to have dialogues around that, and basically finding ways to facilitate access as much as possible for folks who have that fear and can, again, make things more disabling in a psychosocial sense, right? Something that is inherently traumatic and emotionally distressing.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. I also wonder if maybe you could speak to the idea of, this is like not necessarily in the same vein, but it's also like, I know it's part of the work that you do. It reminds me of when we were talking earlier about harm reduction. I was wondering if you could speak to something that I feel like is kind of closely related to, which is like peer support and the work you do with like peer support versus like necessarily like seeing like licensed professionals and stuff, and like how a lot of people have a very strong framework of like, you see a psychiatrist, you see a therapist, can you maybe talk a little bit about what peer support looks like for you?
Absolutely. So the KIVA Centers and the Zia Young Adult Access Center organizations I'm a part of. KIVA Centers is the parent organization. Zia Young Adult Access Center is another organization within. Zia Young Adult Access Center concentrates more on youth and young adults as a social class of people oppressed in their own right. That's a whole other discussion. The KIVA Centers focuses on psychiatric survivors and survivor-led mutual aid efforts, also referred to as peer support, peer-run, peer-led efforts. And the idea of that really gets into, and I love talking about these, I've been talking about them a lot recently, the principles of disability justice. If you get into the principles of disability justice, you have leadership of the most impacted, right? So in peer support, people who are most impacted taking the lead in the discussion and really working together. Interdependence is also a part of those principles. Working together to interdepend on one another, to be reliant in a grassroots sense rather than reliant on systems, right? Systems that can be inherently disabling for whatever reason. Then the focus on collective access and collective liberation. Through these dialogues, we are liberating our own sense, liberating our minds, if you will, of the sense of shame and inherent self-disdain that comes with oppression and trauma, and really in a trauma-informed approach in building those environments of trying to be as informed of people's emotional distress as humanly possible within social class categorizations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I want to go back over to Brian now for a little bit. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this just popped in my head when talking about how today is International People with Disabilities Day. Wasn't yesterday World AIDS Day, I believe, or was that Monday?
Tuesday, the 1st, yeah.
I want to make sure that we can like talk a little bit about your work with HIV/AIDS, in addition to your work with like substance use, and maybe just starting with the basic question of like, what's the difference between HIV and AIDS?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So HIV is a virus that only humans can be infected with. It attacks the immune system. And then AIDS is a syndrome, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which is a disease or a category of many illnesses that can come on when you have, when your immune system isn't working very well. So people many times, many of my clients were diagnosed with AIDS before HIV because they had already reached that state in the early part of the epidemic. And luckily they're still here, they survived it. And then other people you can be infected with HIV, like I can have HIV and never develop AIDS because I am, taking my medications and they work well now. We have a lot of people are on like 1 pill a day. And will probably hopefully many years from now die from something completely unrelated. So those are the different categories of HIV/AIDS. I hope that was.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to either like a little bit about your experience with that kind of work, or maybe talk about I'll give you like a couple of choices of something you could talk about, because there's, we could have an entire panel about just talking about HIV/AIDS, I'm sure. But either like how to offer support to people with HIV or AIDS, some of the like social stigmas that we have around that and ways to like combat that, like ways to be like, hey, what you just said about that isn't okay. Or just kind of like things you've noticed in your work with this. You can talk about anything you like.
Thanks. I wanted to jump on what Vesper was talking about peer support, because that's something that we do where I work, and we're unique now. There's not a lot of programs that in Massachusetts anymore that have a real kind of peer-to-peer community support aspect or component. A lot of times now there's medical case management in your doctor's office. You see someone, they help you fill out some forms, and you're on your way. So we have in normal times, we have congregate meals, lunches, dinners, support groups, and being together, literally in the same room, is so important for folks who have been stigmatized for having HIV, maybe also might be an undocumented immigrant with HIV, or someone who's LGBTQ and has been, rejected by their family, and then they have HIV on top of it. So you have all of this sort of compounded trauma and discrimination and stigma that people have experienced. So being with each other, we laugh a lot, which is, I think, a symbol of when, there's a safe space that people can laugh. And many folks have been through so much that they're there to support each other. And it has been awful. COVID has been terrible for that kind of interaction because we can't do it. We can do Zoom, and people have learned some new technology, but it's really not the same. And with accessibility, you might have a client that has a hearing aid and can't afford to get that Bluetooth adapter because Mass Health doesn't sell it, so they can't actually join on Zoom, and they're dealing with that social isolation because they're trying to keep safe from COVID, but they can't. They're not having that camaraderie that's so important for the long-term survivors, because many folks have surviving it. We don't talk a lot about the long-term survivors. We talk about the folks that we lost tragically, the artists and the generation of queer people that we lost. But then we talk about, in the commercials of the folks that are doing really well, who've been diagnosed recently and in this time of really wonderful medications. But these folks, I feel it's like they've survived the Holocaust. So being with each other is so important. and it's been hard. It's been, it's been hard to tell folks when they say, when are you open? When can we come in? And we're like, we can't, we're not big enough. We can't safely have people gather. So we've been doing support groups on like I said, on Zoom and whatnot, but it's been really, really difficult. And I think I keep hearing from folks, this reminds me of then, this kind of trauma and stigma and talking about disease, and it's bringing up a lot of stuff for folks right now. And then around stigma, something that, I wish could happen more is just talking about it more. We don't talk about it anymore. We don't see it in the news. It's not really brought up a lot. It's kind of, that was then, let's not talk about that. But I think just making people more aware that HIV is a disease, and it can be really it can be really difficult for folks who were on those early medications and now are dealing with all the repercussions of those early medications, those early illnesses, and still that reaching out to those folks, finding out who they are, and supporting them, because many of them have kind of gone back in the closet. And I think, I mean, whether that's in art and storytelling, we start kind of bringing that focus back of who's here, who survived that. Let's make sure that there's room at the table for you.
Awesome. Thank you. That was really powerful. I think I'm noticing kind of a theme here of one of the things that kind of, hurts the community, the general disabled community, is shame. And so I think that's something I've seen come up a few times here tonight. So that was what you said was really powerful. Thank you so much. So now that we're getting close to the end of time here, I want to maybe end on like a slightly higher note, on a slightly more like uplifting note. And I was wondering if maybe we could just go around to each person, and everyone could either like give like an action item of like, here's a thing that you could do to offer support to a disabled person. Like here is like a nice friendly way, a thing you could do for a disabled person tomorrow, or in the next week, or in the next month, or like just a personal story, or something like a goal, like something uplifting or related to pride and disability, if that makes sense to everyone. Cool, I'm seeing some head nods. So I'll just I'll give you all a second to think, and then whoever wants to jump in first can go ahead.
I think something important along the lines of social harm reduction and a lot of things that we're talking about, something you could say and just talking to a disabled person is that they're not inherently damaged or broken because of their experiences, that, our society is beautiful and complex, and that there is beauty in experience, and that we need to have more conversations just openly about our bodies, our minds, who we are, and kind of break away from some of those social taboos that produce this inherent shame. Just opening up the dialogue and really engaging with folks and being honest and bringing your full self to the table.
Thank you.
And I would add to that, yes, the ability to understand how you're feeling. What is your comfort level? What is it that is within yourself that holds you back or disturbs you? And then going to find different outlets to learn more about, disability awareness, history, etiquette, things like that. That is really important for folks. And going out of your way to, just be that ally for folks in the way that they choose, I think is very important.
Again, speaking and having these conversations for sure.
This is my favorite new action item for folks who are working in companies that recently launched a new diversity, inclusion, and belonging initiative following the Black Lives Matter movement events this summer. Take a look at their documentation and events and make sure that these inclusion initiatives are also including people who have disabilities. you might find that that is completely left out, and talk to your bosses and your companies and figure out why that is. Let's work with people who have disabilities and definitely hire people who have disabilities. And if your company is not prepared to do that, there is nothing that you can make or do that will be as accessible unless you are actually working with people who need to use them.
Thank you.
Something we used to do with when I worked at Prism LGBT Health and we were doing risk assessments, we were something that we were contracted to do. So let's start with the negative. We started with the positive. We always asked, what are you most proud of in your life? So I think when you approach people with that, let's start with assets. Let's start with you and your power before we get into the challenges. So we have a real sense of the context of your life and what's meaningful for you. And sometimes, rather than starting with what we need to fix, as we were hearing before, starting with like, what's great? Like, what do you love? What's important to you? So if you're working with a new client or you're meeting a new person, start there, rather than immediately go to, what needs to be fixed or addressed or solved. Because I think we often lose sight of the person and what's in the heart.
And I would also add, language is really important. And the use of language, it's an accessible bathroom. It's not a handicap bathroom. It's an accessible parking space. All those things, I was reading there was an article in one of the local newspapers, and the terms that they were using, wheelchair bound, handicapped child, it just was very derogatory. It did not need, and it doesn't create inclusion and acceptance when you're using those kinds of terms.
Totally, absolutely.
My big thing would be to get involved in your local government. Vote, get to know what's coming up the pipeline for your city or town, and if possible, consider giving to local independent living centers.
In my experience, I would say the next time you're talking to someone who is talking about a disability or really just, maybe physical or psychological problems they're experiencing, listen twice as often as you speak to that person. Let that person express their concerns, their fears, and validate their experience around it. A lot of people that come to me, they feel like a burden, and you want to make sure that they know that's not the case.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Katelyn. I almost totally spaced because we got it towards the beginning of the stream, but we do have an audience question that I will just float out to whoever is interested in answering. So the audience question is, should the greater Boston area have a disability pride parade again when parades are safe, when, COVID and everything?
Yes. We were supposed to have one this year in Boston because it was the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And unfortunately, COVID-19 axed our plans, and we went online, which was just as powerful, but there is something to be said about getting in those streets.
Yes, fantastic. Awesome. Yeah, I would love to see something like that. So fantastic. Thank you. I've never even seen or heard of a disability pride parade before. I think of the only pride parades I've ever kind of been a part of have been the general LGBTQ plus ones in June and July. So I hope that that's something that we can look forward to again soon. So All right, I think, does anybody have any last kind of like pressing things they want to mention, things they want to plug before I start to wrap us up here?
Just on disability pride real quick, there's disability pride, there's neurodiversity pride, there's mad pride, there's a lot of like different subsections of pride and different pride events that have occurred internationally. And I think often like the more popular thought around pride is often, you know, queer and LGBT pride. We're not often talking about the experiences under the disability umbrella.
It's such a powerful thing, especially like talking about earlier. Shame is such a thing that we can really, I think pride hopefully can counteract that, is something that I'm learning here tonight from all of you, is that like pride can counteract that really awful enacted shame that we can, you know, feel inside because of disabilities. So awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. So I want to say again, a huge thank you to our interpreters tonight, Kinsey Williamson and Elizabeth Keegan. We're super grateful to have partners interpreting with us. They've been with us in our other panels and forums before. So y'all are wonderful. I also want to thank Joey Phoenix and Michelle Garcia from Creative Collective. They help make all the technical side of this possible. And we really wouldn't be able to run all of this without them. I also want to shout out again our friends at Eastern Bank. They've given us so much support. So I just want to thank everybody so much. And of course, thank our wonderful panelists. I'm going to give you all just like a little round of applause here. It's been so wonderful getting to like talk with you tonight and learn from you all about different things. Like I hope we got some things in the Facebook chat up. And that people were able to feel seen and feel heard by, you know, some of the wonderful advocates here tonight. And also that some people were able to learn a handful of things, because it is an educational forum. So, and also speaking of like disability pride parades and things to look forward to, one thing to look forward to later this month is our Jump Into January event. It's going to be held on December 30th at 7 p.m. So come hang out with us, send off 2020 and finally welcome in 2021 with this like fun little celebratory event. And we're gonna have lots of different like entertainment things and fun. It'll all be online. So you can go to our website in general if you want more information about North Shore Pride, or you want to watch recordings of previous forums that we've done. You can go to northshorepride.org, or you can like us on Facebook and Instagram, our social medias, and that's where you can find information about our Jump Into January event as well. And we're also working on an ever expanding resources list on our website. So in the vein of talking about accessibility and resources for people with disabilities, like food, housing, money, stuff like that. We're working on our own resource site, like, you know, sidebar that has links to different resources. So check that out as it continues to grow. And any other like final thoughts in the last kind of, we have a couple of spare minutes here. Does anybody have anything you want to plug? I'm seeing a bunch of mics go back off, so.
We've got the City of Boston Disability Commission Advisory Board meeting. Our next meeting is coming up. Our last meeting of the year. It'll be on Zoom, and it's also simulcast on Boston City TV.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Let's say I work at the Health Project, which I mentioned before, North Shore Health Project, healthproject.org up in Gloucester. We provide HIV counseling and testing, STI testing, Hep C testing, overdose prevention, Narcan training, needle exchange, harm reduction, and obviously HIV case management. So if you know anyone or yourself is looking for some services, please just go to healthproject.org.
Yeah, I was also going to add, check out the KIVA Centers. The KIVA Centers is a statewide peer-led organization. Every person has experienced those folks who are most impacted, survivors really taking the lead. There's a variety of support groups that we have via Zoom, via the phone. Also check out our ZIA Young Adult Access Center if you're a young adult in need of support. And that requires no registration, referral, or sign up.
And the Disability Resource Center is a great source of support and advocacy for folks with disabilities. We service people with any type of disability and all ages. And we do not require any documentation, just self-disclosure. All of our services are free, and we do a lot of work getting people into housing, transportation, SSI, legal services, food services, technology needs, advocacy, and then we do a lot within the community, politically, locally and statewide and nationwide to advance accessibility and inclusion.
I guess I'll give myself a quick little plug. I do want people to know, in all seriousness, that I do offer free strategy sessions. So even if you just want to reach out to me, talk about whether applying for benefits would be a good idea for you, and we can kind of go over what I think you should do to give yourself the best chance. Like, please do reach out. There's no kind of charge for that kind of service. And really just what I wanted to do is echo what Brian said at the beginning. I was really looking forward to learning from all the other panelists today, and it's been a wonderful evening of doing so. So much of my work is talking about what people aren't able to do anymore, and not so much about accessibility and accommodation. So this has been a really wonderful experience. So thank you to North Shore Pride for having me.
Thank you for being here. Awesome. All right, well, one last time, we'll see you on December 30th, hopefully, for our Jump into January event. That'll be at 7 p.m. on December 30th. And thank you again, just so much, everyone, for being here tonight. You are all so wonderful to talk to, and I am so proud of you, and all the wonderful work that you do, and everything that and being here and talking with us tonight. So, all right, thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a great night.